On civil wars. When considering the different kinds of terrible armed conflict which human beings engage in, I've often concentrated on national or international wars. These are the most visible, and the casualties in many of them are appalling, atrocious. And I've paid less attention to civil wars. I did study at Oxford, particularly the 17th century and the English Civil War, and also earlier the Wars of the Roses between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists over the 15th century. But apart from that and occasional views of civil wars in other countries, I hadn't really thought much about it. But now I do think about it, particularly when I have recently been studying China, because in China the devastating effect of civil wars are even more marked in many ways than other kinds of wars. China has expanded often quite peacefully, and when it has encountered other forces, they've been wandering groups of nomadic people like the Mongols and the Manchus, and the battles were fairly small scale or spaced apart. But it has been subject internally to several terrible civil wars. These often were related to religious fundamentalist movements. The White Lotus, for example, in the 18th, early 19th century, and above all the Taiping Rebellion in the late 1840s, which it's estimated led to the death either through the fighting or the starvation and so on around it of 20 to 30 million people at least. That's huge. That's the sort of casualties you find on the battlefield of Europe in the Second World War. And there were other examples. The other great example is in the much more recent, in the middle of the 20th century, the civil war between the Kuomintang, the nationalist armies, and the communists in the middle and later 1940s. This was aggravated, of course, by the fact that there was also a battle going on from 1937 at least with the Japanese for 8 years. And if you put those two things together, you get the most appalling casualties, perhaps in the 20th century in warfare. Almost, you get 30-40 million people killed in those civil wars and anti-Japanese wars. So civil wars are particularly lethal because the pain and suffering caused when people who are not at all different, they often are neighbours. The appalling civil wars in the Balkans, they went in the old parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those were particularly horrible because one day you're with your neighbours having a cup of coffee and so on, the next day you're killing them, or they're killing you, or whatever. And this was similar in the English Civil War. Families were torn apart. One family, which knew others very well, suddenly was faced with them on the battlefield. And so I think the suffering, the psychological and other suffering, as well as the military suffering of civil wars, are appalling to contemplate. One thing about the English civil wars is that compared to the sort of civil wars you had in many continental countries compared to the 30 Years' War in Germany, which ravaged much of Europe, or the civil wars in France in the 15th, 16th century. The English civil wars were fairly tame. You're talking about maybe tens of thousands of people at the most dying in the English Civil War, and a little more maybe in the Wars of the Roses. But they were restrained for various reasons. The population was not very well armed, hardly any weapons at all before the English Civil War were available to people, and you knew that these were your neighbours, and you might go out and have a fight with them, but you were going to live with them afterwards. So they had the aspect of a sort of grand and rather bloody form of cricket or football. And when continental historians look at the English civil wars, they say, well, comparatively, they are mild, and not what you find in the great civilizations of India or China or right across Europe. But they're bad enough. And there are contemporary interests in this, because the next civil war that some people are contemplating is in America. It seems strange to say, but a number of my friends coming recently from America have said that America, that is the United States, is so polarized that people are not talking to each other, not looking at the same media, not hearing about the same worlds, and that towns and streets and families are becoming totally divided and heavily armed, of course. So it wouldn't take very much for someone who wants to overthrow the government or take a state to secede or whatever, to spark something which could end up in a civil war of the kind of which, of course, America had in the 19th century over slavery. And that would be absolutely appalling. One needs to go a long, long way before turning things into a civil war. Hopefully, the country I live in has not any tendencies in that direction, and we quarrel and grumble, the North against the South and the X against the Y, but there's not much sign of civil wars here. But it wouldn't surprise me if that happened in America, at least to a limited extent, and possibly in other European countries. So beware of this appalling, unnecessary and brutal form of interpersonal conflict, civil wars.